Our next speaker is Mike Marlow, and he's going to talk about guard animals and other, mostly about guard animals for livestock protection against predators. Mike?
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to be here. Quick little introduction. I'm Michael Marlow. I'm a wildlife biologist with USDA Wildlife Services Program, and I'm stationed out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And I've met several people here in the audience, and they've asked me where I'm from, and I tell them Colorado, and they're a bit surprised that I came all the way out here for this, except for this gentleman here on the front row who knew that I was coming. He wore his Got Grass hat, I noticed. And second observation I'd like to quickly make is coming from Oklahoma. I've spent 20 years in the Wildlife Services Program, and I'm a little bit out of my element up here in the north, but it's kind of refreshing. It's probably the first workshop that I've done where I'm the only one in the room that doesn't have an accent. And so they've asked me to come out here and talk about guard animals, but I want to start out that presently I'm the resource management specialist with USDA Wildlife Services. And with that, I basically assist Wildlife Services in broadening our knowledge, our opportunities to work with stakeholders, and our research component to broaden our knowledge in the use of integrated wildlife damage management. David spoke a lot about our lack thereof of integrated wildlife damage management here in the state of Wisconsin, and I hope to place some higher emphasis on that throughout my presentation. Primarily, I focus on livestock protection, and a lot of that is with predators and predator management. A big component of that is livestock protection dogs. Now, actually, what I've said, I work a lot with integrated wildlife damage management. They've asked me to talk about guard animals, and so I'll focus a lot upon that. Now realize that livestock protection dogs are very prevalent within the industry of the sheep society. It's not unprecedented to see livestock protection dogs in cattle operations and other operations, but it is a little bit different. But we see great success, especially in the Northwest and the Western United States, with livestock protection dogs in areas of sheep production. So I want to start today by talking about livestock protection dogs and a little bit of history on livestock protection dogs. In the late 1970s, a lot of it was emphasized through the sheep industry and our actual research component, to where we saw a resurgence in the use of livestock protection dogs for primarily sheep protection. That was primarily a result of three things. The first thing being federal restrictions placed on the use of pesticides. Back during the Nixon administration, there was a big study and a big push, and we lost our use of some of our primary pesticides, primarily that of sodium cyanide using an M44 device, and also with sodium fluoroacetate, which you might know from the livestock protection collar. So, with this loss, it put a greater emphasis on coming up with other solutions to predator management. The second thing was the inability of existing techniques to offer, adequate relief. We still saw a lot of, increasing predation in a lot of areas, predominantly coyote depredation on livestock. And the third thing was a desire by some, and you see that even more and more today, and that's a push to use more and more non-lethal technologies. Now, it's not a new thing historically worldwide. Livestock protection dogs have been used ever since man, brought them into domestication, and they've been used throughout the world. But it wasn't until this time in the late 70s and the early 80s that they actually became more and more popular in the United States. They're most commonly used to protect sheep, like I said, but they're also helpful in protecting other species of livestock. We're seeing more and more in western Wyoming, around the Green River Valley, the implementation of dogs in grizzly bear and wolf country, in not only sheep but also cattle operations. And so, like I say, it's not unprecedented. However, it's not one that you'd see as widespread use that you would see in sheep production. They're working dogs that stay with or near livestock most of the time, and they aggressively repel those predators who, actually try to provide, try to confront the livestock. And this is where I guess it's a little bit different in the sense of cattle, is in that sense that, sheep are flocking animals, whereas cattle typically graze over a wider landscape. The herds are scattered, and so therefore, the way the ability of the dog is somewhat handicapped, especially in the western United States, where you may be, grazing on operations that, may, include 30,000 or more acres. I understand through some of the presentations today, not necessarily a typical, but an average size ranch here may, consist of a couple sections of land upwards of 1,200 acres. And so I can see, there's some relevance to how a dog operates, that they could actually maybe have some positive influence here in this type of production zone. They're an important component of managing livestock, not only on large landscapes, like I said, in the west, but also smaller landscapes. Like I say, we use them in the west on huge, vast amounts of land, including the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service grazing allotments. When you think about livestock protection dogs and how they compare to other traditional non-lethal types of preventative methods, I'm going to show you on these next two graphs exactly how they kind of gauge up. The fourth area there, if you have any difficulty seeing that, is actually the cost to implement livestock protection dogs. And this came from a study through the American sheep industry from 2009 data that was published in 2010. And as you can see, compared to some of the more traditional methods of livestock protection, such as shed lambing, where you're actually bringing your ewes into a barn to actually lamb, or actual fencing, it could be a predator-proof fencing or electrical fencing. Comparatively, the cost to implement livestock protection dogs is relatively low. I've got a couple other methods there called shooting, which obviously isn't an option here in a strictly non-lethal capacity state, and also other methods, which would include arrow hunting and some other non-traditional type methods. And so when you see the relative cost for implementing livestock protection dogs is low, and when you compare that to what the producers actually see as a relatively return, how happy are they with the actual implementation of these methods, you see that the livestock protection dog almost equals that of shed lambing. When you have shed lambing, you've totally excluded access for the predator to get to the offspring. So therefore, you're going to eliminate, if not completely, you're going to reduce or if not completely eliminate depredation on those lambs. And so, but the return on that bang for your buck, I guess you could say, is very high. So, they are well perceived, well received within the sheep industry. With that, I want to take a look at some pros, and then I'm going to talk about some cons, and I'm going to talk about how we can maybe, adapt this for, how it would apply for states such as yours here in Wisconsin, maybe Minnesota, and some of the Great Lakes regions. Livestock protection dogs, as I said, can guard a variety of livestock. They're known to, protect sheep, cattle. People use them on poultry operations, wildlife operations. So they do have an opportunity to have some diverse use. They're typically able to analyze threats, and this is very important. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but dogs, for the most part, are very intelligent, and so they're going to be able to perceive between an active threat and maybe just a situation that's not typically normal, where they're not going to be vicious or potentially cause harm in a situation where other types of animals could potentially react in a more negative way. And so they are intelligent. They are able to analyze when it's actual threat of predation versus just some unique situation. One thing that makes it beneficial is livestock protection dogs are able to bond to the livestock that they're protecting. You typically do this in the sheep industry by actually introducing those dogs to young lambs and a ewe early on. And they, a lot of people think that these dogs actually thank their sheep, and they don't thank their sheep. I mean, it's just the fact that they're comfortable around the sheep and they enjoy being around them, and so they're going to protect these sheep. And so that may be a difficult facet in trying to actually bond these to cattle. But one thing I encourage is for people to be innovative, and regardless if it's sheep industry or cattle industry or poultry industry, dogs are a great investment. It's going to take a lot of time and energy spent to make a proper livestock protection guardian, and so it's not something it is innate within the dogs to protect in a way. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of effort and time and responsibility that the producer has to devote to this success. And so bonding that to cattle may be a little bit more challenging, but it's something that like I say, we are looking at. Other producers are trying it, and so that's part of the important components of how livestock protection dogs accomplish, what our goals are. They may alert producers to potential threats. Dogs are vocal; they bark, and so in the West, when you have dogs that may be hundreds of miles, or not hundreds of miles, but tens of miles away from human presence, every night or every day, this may not be as big a deal. But here in smaller landscapes, if you're near your pastures and dogs are carrying on and barking, it could alert you to the fact that something's going on and maybe allow you to have a response to this situation. So that's an important component, a positive component of livestock protection dogs. They may allow for greater pasture use and grazing. David, commented about some of these pastures where we've had to pull off, cattle or livestock completely. And so dogs may, because of from their territorial nature, allow for, these pastures that may have been historically vulnerable to predation. And so, that's one thing I'll throw out this caution is, I think it was Mr. Link here mentioned pack sizes as many as 20 or 25 animals. And that's what we're seeing in the Rocky Mountain region now, and we're actually doing a study. The National Wildlife Research Center is conducting a study, because what we're seeing is we're actually seeing mortality in livestock protection dogs in these areas that have these large, packs of wolves. When you're talking about a wolf in the Great Lakes region, I'm not for sure what the average weights are, but some of our wolves in the northern territories, Rocky Mountain territories, easily exceed over 100, 120 pounds. And so when you have 20 or 25 animals maybe combating or trying to come in on livestock, and they're only be defended by 6 or 7 dogs, do the math. And so one thing that, ethically, we don't necessarily encourage the use of dogs where we're seeing impacts of mortality to the dogs, but we're actually doing research and trying to identify breeds of dogs that historically were used in Europe, presently against wolves and bears in those countries. And so we're looking at a more athletic, a larger, more vicious dog, canine vicious, but these dogs had to meet certain criteria, and one of those criteria was to be human tolerant. And so that study is actively going on now, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that towards the end of my presentation. LPDs provide long-term protection as predators do not become accustomed or habituated. And so David talked about how these wolves have become habituated to all these non-lethal technologies. And so we don't see that with dogs. They don't habituate. It's a constant, a vigilance that, these dogs, have the capability they have to not allow these predators to habituate to their presence. And so that's a positive attribute. However, every rose has its thorn, and there are definitely disadvantages of livestock protection dogs. I'll touch a little bit upon that now. They may kill your livestock, and so that's not... If they're out there to protect your livestock and they're killing their livestock, that's not obviously an advantage. But what that typically you see that in the young dogs that are maybe too playful with a calf or a lamb, and they actually kill. Some of this actually evolves from lack of producer responsibility. They put their cattle out on pasture. They ask for the dog to just provide for himself, and so a hungry dog is going to do what it takes to survive. And so some of this is actually self-imposed by the producer themselves, something to be aware of. They may harass and kill non-target wildlife. If you're a cattleman but you also love deer hunting, and these dogs potentially chase your deer away, that may not be something that's a positive attribute towards your operation. We don't see that so much with the people we talk to in the East. Where we see it is some of our adversarial groups are concerned with these dogs, altering grizzly bear migration patterns, or actually disrupting habitat corridors where other wildlife are actually naturally moving. And so we get a lot of negative response from the use of livestock protection dogs on public lands as a result of this capability. So something to be aware of. Third is they may wander unless adequately fenced, and that can be a big problem, especially in smaller landscapes. If you have a neighbor that raises Labrador retrievers and his bitches go in heat, and your livestock protection dog is not protecting your cattle, and he's over there trying to service those dogs on that Labrador ranch, it's going to have problems. And so, that's something to be aware of. There are certain technologies being developed. Some are better than others that are in development now. Virtual fencing, to where some of the earlier ones were actually buried electrical cable to where a caller would actually keep that dog from crossing. Now you're getting more technology that allows for satellite usage and telemetry type applications. But certainly something to be aware of. These dogs, especially in boredom, will wander, but in areas where urban landscapes or these rural landscapes where neighbors may have dogs and others may have dogs, wandering can be definitely a negative, aspect. They may be aggressive to strangers. We've done a lot to try to educate the public. I'll talk about that a little bit more detailed later. But if you have neighbors that have, hunting dogs or, young children that frequently pass by your place, certainly something to be aware of. They may be aggressive to strangers. We do have mechanisms that we try to help people identify certain types of dogs and certain types of breeds for certain types of situations, and the aggression towards humans is one of these attributes that some dogs may possess that others don't. So certainly something to consider. LPDs may not tolerate herding or other farm dogs. So if you're using spaniels or heelers or kelpies or whatever it may be to periodically herd your cattle, you'd have to take that in consideration. If you have livestock protection dogs out on the pasture and they see a dog chasing these calves or sheep or whatever it may be, could be a train wreck. And so you need to make that yourself aware of that. And it's not always compatible, and so certainly something to consider. They need time and guidance to mature properly. So they take time and they take guidance, and this guidance is an investment from you as a producer. And so, a dog sometimes, we recognize doesn't reach this maturity where he's able to actually defend against, these adversarial predators, maybe until they're 2 or 3 years old. But with that, we typically see 7 or 8 good years following that, with the application of livestock protection dogs. So it's something to realize that it's not something that's going to, happen overnight. It is a time-consumptive, type process. They'll bark, especially at night. That's a good thing, but it could be a negative thing. And like I say, I'm talking about this interface with your neighbors. And so if you have neighbors that, don't appreciate a dog barking every time a raccoon or a possum or a fox or a coyote, comes near, then that could potentially be something that, you'd want to consider. Having predators and angry neighbors, you may rather prefer to have angry neighbors and keep the predators away, but, something definitely to take into consideration. Not so much of a big deal here in the east as it is in the west, but you've got to realize that using dogs sometimes eliminates the capability of using other predator protection mechanisms. In the west, we have the pleasure of being able to use certain predicides, M44s, in certain instances to reduce conflicts with predators. However, that's not necessarily compatible when you're using dogs, because these are, poisons that are dogs that are and canines in general are susceptible to. I don't think that's not a tool that's necessary to use here in Wisconsin, but traps and snares also you must take in consideration. If you have traps on the landscape or snares, these dogs are vulnerable to those as well. We actually, have, research where we've actually been able to train them to avoid the poisons from the application of through M44 devices, but, just curiosity or whatnot around a trap set or snare set could potentially be harmful to that, investment that you've made with the livestock protection dog. So certainly something to consider. I want to talk a little bit about protecting this resource. In Colorado, the American Sheep Industry Association claims without the livestock protection dog for the protection of sheep, they'd be totally out of business. And so it's a tool that they heavily rely upon, if not totally dependent upon. And so we've seen a lot of situations where it necessitates a group effort to actually protect this livestock protection dog, protect this valuable resource in livestock protection. And one way we've banded together to accomplish this is through education. As a service, Wildlife Services, we've produced several pieces of written literature in the form of fact sheets that are available on our website. Historically, we've been able to provide guidance through publications such as the Livestock Guarding Dog Protecting Sheep from Predators publication, but also there's a plethora of information available on the internet that would help guide a producer on actually properly preparing and utilizing these dogs in the application of livestock protection. And so, educating the producer is very, very important to help protect this resource. Comes along with not only being knowledgeable, but you have responsibilities. And we see this more and more in the West. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more people using public lands for hiking, biking, horseback riding, just outdoor use in general. And with that, we've seen an increase in conflicts with livestock protection dogs on public lands. And so we don't necessarily see, that except for those people who refuse to realize that their little, poodle off leash running around on the forest trail, running into a pack of sheep is a good thing, because it's not. And these dogs, like I say, they're able to analyze threats, but when this dog runs into sheep, it's a potential train wreck, and we've had several instances where that's become an issue. We're seeing more and more conflicts with livestock protection dogs around, urban and rural areas that were traditionally used for farming, but they're now being used for what we call little ranchettes in the West. And so we're seeing more and more conflicts between neighbors with livestock protection dogs. And so producer responsibility goes a big way. And so when you think about, well, that can't be that, big a deal, when the Los Angeles Times runs articles such as this, where ranching and recreation collide in the great outdoors, it is a big deal. I mean, it's something that we recognize nationally as a problem. And what this particular article stemmed from was an incident in about 2008, Eagle, Colorado, where a mountain biker was in a race, and she got separated from the group of people. And so the Forest Service had contacted the producer that there was a race going to be coming through his allotment. And so when the group of riders came through, a few hours later, he released his dogs. Well, unbeknownst to the rest of the riders and the organizers, there was a lady who had fallen way behind. And she actually rode into a band of sheep. And with that came some horrible consequences. She was attacked by these dogs and viciously attacked, and didn't die, but had upwards of 80 or 90 stitches, I understand. But it set into motion a huge backlash from the public, and especially those who are looking for ways to get people off of public lands. They may not have a problem with the dogs, but they use this as a tool because they're against public grazing, they're against agricultural use on public lands, and trust me, it had a huge fallout. And so when I talk about producer responsibility, I'm talking about more, along the lines of this as well, where you have these dogs that are on public lands, and this is the article in Southwest Colorado, where the sheep industry is so dependent upon these animals, yet you see headlines such as this, that fierce sheepdogs are alarming tourists in Southwest Colorado. And basically it goes back to people who are producers and not using those dogs that have been properly socialized or properly, trained to actually be out and around the public. They've taken these dogs and they've basically just turned them loose. Sometimes they're free breeding. They've not been acclimated to human presence, not been socialized properly, and so with that becomes some huge conflicts. And so the American sheep industry has been proactive. We as an agency have tried to help them be proactive, and we've come up with some livestock protection dog best management practices. And what these have done is they've allowed for us to help optimize the use of LPDs and minimize these conflicts. And so it's not just producers. A lot of the problems can be attributed to the lack of knowledge, or lack of a better word, ignorance on the general public on how they should react to, sheep and sheepdogs on public lands. And so we've worked with the sheep industry and the Forest Service and BLM to produce these signs that we've actually implemented throughout public lands, trailheads, trails, parking spots all along these national forest landscapes, to where we can educate the public on the do's and don'ts around these dogs. If you see sheep, don't approach them, avoid them, keep your dog on a leash. If you are confronted, this is what you should do. And so it's gone a long ways. We've evidently deterred some of the conflict, but and we've made this available initially. We've exhausted a resource twice on the production of these, along with a complimentary brochure. but we're in development now. We're going to produce this on more of a heavy-duty, rubberized, vinylized type plastic adhesive, to where producers can purchase those in bulks of 10 and apply them to a metal backing, and hopefully get those out not only on the public lands but on private lands as well. When this was initially developed, it was developed for public land use. We saw a great response, and we actually wrote it to actually apply to private lands, and it's also available in Spanish. Especially, we see a lot of that need in the western United States. And so there's a lot of educational components involved with this, as I mentioned. Complimentary brochure went along with this. You can find this in a lot of our different Forest Service visitors centers, trailheads, and throughout the West, where the public, can use this resource to educate themselves. Moving on a little bit, this is a talk about guard animals, not just livestock protection dogs, and so we get a lot of questions about the use of llamas. Llamas do have some attributes that some dogs don't possess that are beneficial. They also have some negatives, and I want to talk a little bit about both of those. For instance, they possess a behavioral and physical characteristic that makes them favorable livestock protectors, and some of these attributes they're highly sociable, and so if you got a llama or two out in a pasture, they want to be around the other livestock. Maybe want to be around horses, they may want to be around sheep, they may want to be around cattle, whatever that is. I mean, it's not like they do bond in a way, but not like dogs necessarily, but they're sociable animals. They want to be around other animals, and so you might, if you're not familiar with llamas, you might think, that's odd. I mean, how would they be protective of my livestock? Well, they're aggressive against canines. It's naturally innate ability or dislike of coyotes, foxes, wolves, dogs, whatever it may be. And just innately they have a strong aggressive disposition towards these animals. So that's where it comes as a protective mechanism. Now realize they also are much taller than sheep. They're much taller than cattle, and so they can actually see and maybe perceive a threat quicker and sooner than your livestock may be able to see and react to it. So that's an advantage that they possess. Unlike dogs, though, they don't actively guard your sheep. Dogs will actually try to maybe flock and get around the sheep, and they're actually protecting the sheep. It's an indirect response from llamas. They're protecting themselves, but that indirectly, your sheep or cattle or horses or poultry may benefit from that. So they're not quite bonded like a dog would, but you do actually, benefit from that indirect type of protection. Like I say, there's pros and there's cons with most every tool. Llamas are naturally social. They bond fairly quickly, so that's a positive. They're naturally aggressive to foxes, coyotes, dogs, other canine species, wolves potentially. They have similar maintenance, shelter, and feeding needs as sheep and goats. They graze the same pastures, so I assume that they're going to graze the same types of pastures as cattle, so that would be a positive. They generally have a calm temperament towards humans, so you're not going to have to worry about getting necessarily bitten. You might get chased or intimidated a bit, but for the most part, they're pretty calm, reasonable animals. They're long-lived, 20-25 years, actually outlive the life expectancy of a dog. So, your initial investment could be, realized pretty quick and have, long-term impacts to your protection of livestock. They don't roam, they don't dig, and they don't bark. So that's a negative that dogs sometimes possess that llamas don't have. There are cons with the llamas. Several of these would be relevant to your situation here in Wisconsin. They're vulnerable to being preyed upon by coyotes and dogs, so I'd suspect they'd be vulnerable to being preyed upon by wolves as well. So that's something to recognize. There's difficult in defending against multiple animals, and you typically don't think about one wolf. You think about a pack of wolves. And so, that's something to recognize. It could potentially work, but then again, it may have, negative consequences to the llama and your investment there. They're less successful in pastures with dense vegetation or on large open grasslands. Now, I don't think that large open grasslands would be applicable here, but I suspect driving on the highways, I saw the map that David showed. Wolves are moving more and more in these, pasture and cropland type situations, but some of your forests are very dense. So this may be a handicap. This may be something that's not suitable for certain landscapes here in Wisconsin, but then again, it may be something worth investigating. Llamas may have difficulty adjusting living alone. A lot of times they're lonely, but if they bond and socialize well with your animals, that may not be a problem. But you might think, well, let's just get multiple llamas. But then you run into the problem that if you have multiple llamas, a lot of times the llamas want to hang out together and they won't actually intermingle with your livestock. So that's something you want to consider. They usually cannot be utilized with livestock protection dogs. Logically, obviously, if they don't like dogs, they're not going to be able to work in tandem with these dogs. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't be something worth testing to see if you could actually, break that, or actually create a bond. But then, if you get the llama used to dogs, then he may not be as big a threat, or as aggressive towards those dogs you're trying to protect against. So, not always compatible with other applications of dogs. Donkeys. You see more and more literature, you see more and more evidence of donkeys being used in cattle applications. Donkeys are indeed, another animal to consider. They possess characteristics that make them favorable livestock producers, much like the llamas. They're highly territorial. And so if you have a 200-acre pasture and he lays that down and claims that as his territory, that's a good thing. And so you think, well, he's territorial to what? Other donkeys? Well, no, he's actually territorial just in general, and they instinctively do not like canines, and they're aggressive towards them. So if he's claimed this as his territory and you have this potential for canine adversaries, then this could be a positive tool. Could be something that would be beneficial in your particular situation. They're an alert animal in pasture. You see them a lot of times, they're just standing there, but they're actually very alert and very keen on being able to perceive potential threats. So that's a good thing. Much like llamas, they're not purposely, protective of your livestock. It's an indirect thing. He's looking out for himself, but your livestock benefit indirectly. So much like the llama, that's pretty much the same type of deal. Looking at some of the positive aspects beyond those I've mentioned, they typically bray loudly during times of perceived threats. So that much as I mentioned that dogs are vocal and may alert you to the presence of predators or threats, same with the donkeys. If you hear a donkey braying repetitively, it could very well indicate, you have a problem going on and you can respond to it. Donkeys possess very good hearing and a wide field of vision. So maybe they may not stand as tall as the llamas, but they do actually have this attribute which allows them to be very aware of what's going on around them. So that's certainly a positive attribute. They're likely to stand their ground when challenged. They're pretty hard-headed, pretty tough. They'll stomp a dog into paste and a coyote and whatnot. And so I'm not saying he's necessarily capable of fending off multiple predators, but he's definitely a worthy opponent. And so it's definitely something that take into consideration. As well as llamas are long-lived, upwards of 30 years. So, relatively small investment for a long return. So certainly a potential positive for you. Pretty calm. They pose little threat. It's recommended that people don't have intact jacks. Typically, a Jenny with maybe a foal is your best choice. Even then, sometimes some people think that more is better, but no. Typically, same with the llamas. If you have more than one, males will typically may fight or may team up and avoid your other livestock. However, a Jenny with a foal is probably the most you'd want to apply. And I've seen the numbers, and depending on the size of pasture, but a Jenny with a foal and the herd of 200 cattle is in Texas especially can be a good ratio. So not a huge monetary investment and relatively easy to take care of. Unlike dogs, they don't roam, dig, or bark, just like llamas. So if you're in an area where you have potential concerns with your dog wandering, donkeys may be a solution to that. They are compatible, unlike dogs, with traps and other poison efforts. And so not necessarily applicable here to you in Wisconsin with the parasiticides, but if you do have a mechanism, and I'm not saying towards wolves, but I'm sure you trap coyotes and fox and whatnot periodically, so that the donkeys would be compatible with this type of damage technology. There are cons as well with donkeys. They may only react if they are threatened. It's like I said with the llamas, it's an indirect protection. But if they feel threatened, they're very capable of maybe deterring that potential impact from predators trying to prey upon your livestock. They cannot deal with multiple canine attackers typically. So when you're talking about 20 wolves in a pack and the way they actually approach livestock, sometimes that may not have good results. But definitely something to look at and consider. They may bray a great deal just because, and so they could drive you nuts and certainly drive your neighbors nuts. So depending on your situation and where you're actually, the proximity of this animal you have to yourself or your neighbors, certainly something to consider. They may have little guarding effect to widely scattered livestock, cattle, or in large pastures, rough terrain, or heavy brush. And so, each situation is different, but you never know till you try. And so, certainly something to take into consideration. And maybe it may work in certain pastures, but maybe not in others. But just because it doesn't work here doesn't mean it may not work there. So, certainly something to consider. They may accept herding dogs, or they may not. And that's the same with the livestock protection dogs. So if you rely heavily upon herding dogs, or you have a prize, very successful livestock protection dog, the addition of a donkey to this integrated approach may not be your best bet. So something to consider. Donkeys may harass other livestock. They can cause injuries, and so if you have a donkey that's actually shown to be aggressive to the other livestock, probably best to immediately get it out. It's probably not going to change. You have those that just don't get along, and so certainly consider that. Doesn't mean all donkeys are that way, but certain attitudes, just like us, we all act a little bit different, and that they're no different. In wrapping this up, I usually mention this the first of my presentation, but I certainly always end with it, and that is that you must recognize that there is no tool that's 100% effective in the realm of livestock protection. David, spoke heavily about it. I talk about integrated wildlife damage management, which is a combination of preventative methods, but also a combination of control methods. And so there is no one tool. A gentleman back here next to me asked if I brought a silver bullet. I wish we had one. We don't. We probably never will. And so it's being innovative, it's being creative, it's trying new things, it's trying new techniques, it's trying, just to identify what is your vulnerability, and how can I adapt to overcome that and to shore that vulnerability up. And so using these different tools, livestock guard animals may be another component of that mix, of that montage of tools. And so certainly recognize that it's going to be better if you integrate. And in my travels and in my presentations, I always talk about this integrated approach to predator control. And so it's something that I know it makes people angry, and there's a lot of anti-sentiment towards these protective measures that go back and forth through the courts and all, and our adversarial groups suing us. And while our adversarial groups like to claim that we can prevent livestock damage and predation damage to livestock in a non-lethal fashion, it's simply not true. And our professional society that we have a great relationship with, that represents all facets of wildlife management, wildlife damage management, and whatnot, the Wildlife Society, they actually recognize, and I quote, "Prevention or control of wildlife damage, which often includes the removal of the animals responsible for the damage, is an essential and a responsible part of wildlife management." And that's what it boils down to. It's an integrated approach that's going to require a combination of non-lethal methods which are typically preventative methods, and those methods of control, which are typically lethal. And in the end, I think that's what's most important. And so with that, I'll leave it up to any question.